I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink. Several years later, the minister passed away. The cause was an internal hemorrhage, and he died choking on his own blood. Welcome back to Fireside Fables. I'm Nicole Midas. The Salem Witch Trials began in 1692, and to this day, they loom large in the American imagination. They account for some of the most infamous witch trials around the world. This is in spite of the fact that they are nowhere near the largest nor the deadliest trials. Compared to the witch trials of early modern Europe, such as in Edinburgh in 1590 or in Cologne in 1692, the Salem trials had fewer victims. Part of Salem's notoriety could be due to how late the trials occurred. Most trials during the European witch craze occurred between 1550 and 1650. Salem was also unique in that many of its victims did not fit the typical profile of accused witches. Usually, accused witches were social outcasts. The majority were women. They were often poor, childless, or had transgressed society's rules in some way. But in Salem, many of the accused were esteemed members of society, including religious leaders and affluent people, men and women. The trials represented the last gasps of Puritan leadership in New England, after which their theocracy crumbled for a variety of reasons. I've written extensively about the history of the Salem Witch Trials on my Substack, so if this is something you're interested and you'd like to see more videos on this topic, let me know. But this is a show about folklore. What I'd like to discuss today are the stories that sprung from this event. The legends, the ghosts, the alleged curses. Let's dive in. One story from the trial's inception illuminates the conflict between the religious establishment and folk magic. The first two girls to experience strange fits that started the trials were Betty Parris, the daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris of Salem Village, and her cousin, Abigail Williams. Fun fact, Salem Village is actually not in the city of Salem. Salem Village is now Danvers, Massachusetts. So the initial accusations came from Salem Village, or what is now Danvers, but the trials took place in Salem Town, which is the city of Salem today. And speaking of Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, if you've seen Arthur Miller's The Crucible, the whole story about Abigail Williams seducing John Proctor and seeking revenge on his wife, all of that is pure fiction. Betty and Abigail were not young women. They were little girls. Betty was only 9 and Abigail was 11. That always makes me really sad. On February 25th, 1692, while the Reverend and Mrs. Parris were away, their neighbor, Mary Sibley, instructed the Parrises' enslaved servants, an indigenous couple named John Indian and Tituba, to make a witch cake. So that's another deviation from The Crucible. By the records that we have, Tituba and her husband were described as Native Americans. A witch cake is an example of folk magic used to catch a witch. You bake a loaf of rye bread mixed with the urine of the bewitched, and you feed it to the family dog, and the dog is supposed to lead you to the culprit. Prior to the early modern period, medieval Christians had surprisingly nuanced views regarding these sorts of folk magical customs. Witch trials were actually pretty uncommon during that time. I think we have this idea of witch trials being a medieval thing because of Monty Python. Charms used for healing and protection were good. Necromancy and summoning demons were bad. But by the late 16th and 17th centuries, you see this shift in which any kind of folk magical custom would be considered bad regardless of the intention. Sibley was publicly condemned by the Reverend for the witch cake, though she did escape being accused of witchcraft. The same, of course, cannot be said for Tituba. After the baking of the witch cake, Betty and Abigail announced that Tituba was the witch. But Tituba did not die in the trials. She actually escaped that fate by confessing to the crime of witchcraft and then accusing other witches. This is another aspect of the story that made the Salem trials so notorious. Those who confessed and then accused others escaped with their lives. Those who maintained their innocence were condemned. Which brings us to one of the alleged curses from the trials. Sarah Good was one of the early victims of the trials, and she did actually fit the typical image of the accused witch. Sarah Good was married, but she was a poor, elderly woman who was known for having a foul temper. Just before Good's execution, a voice in the crowd begged her to confess. It was Salem Town's junior minister, Nicholas Noyes. If she confessed now, he reasoned, she wouldn't die a liar. But Good said, "You are the liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." Several years later, the minister passed away. The cause was an internal hemorrhage, and he died choking on his own blood. Now, if you visit Salem today, the witch trials are front and center in the city's tourism, ranging from somber memorials for the victims to lighthearted witch city attractions. But for most of Salem's history, the witch trials were a source of real shame, superstition, and religious extremism, which the residents wanted to forget. It wouldn't be until the mid-20th century that the city was truly ready to dig into its past. There were several reasons for this. One was that in 1949, Marion Starkey published a best-selling nonfiction book about the trials called The Devil in Massachusetts. This was closely followed by Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, which premiered in 1953. With increased attention came more tourism, which the city desperately needed as it was entering its post-industrial era. Then, of course, the show Bewitched came to Salem in 1970 to film 8 special episodes. And a statue of Elizabeth Montgomery was erected in Lappin Park in downtown Salem to commemorate the show. With its new Witch City branding, Salem's folklore continued to develop. A wonderful resource on New England folklore is the work of Robert Ellis Cahill, a folklorist who at one point served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and was the sheriff of Essex County in the 1970s. During his life, he published over 36 books recording the folklore of the region. In Cahill's 1992 book, Haunted Happenings, which is also the name of the Halloween festival that Salem hosts every October, Cahill recounts the story of Giles Corey, who was famously pressed to death during the Salem Witch Trials by then Sheriff George Corwin. If that name, George Corwin, sounds familiar to you, it's because he was actually the nephew of Jonathan Corwin, who was one of the judges during the trials, and his home is actually now a museum in Salem that you can visit. Legend has it that Giles Corey placed a curse on George Corwin and all future sheriffs of Essex County. I'll read to you what Corwin had to say about this bit of folklore. "Every high sheriff of Essex County, it seems, from the cruel George Corwin to myself, elected to the post 280 years later, has suffered in some way from Giles Corey's curse. Sheriff Corwin was so disliked by the people of Salem that when he died of a heart attack in 1696, his family didn't dare bury him in the cemetery for fear that he'd be dug up and his body torn from limb to limb. He was instead temporarily buried in the basement of his own home, a place today known as the Joshua Ward House and considered quite haunted." We're going to talk about that too. From all the information that has been made available to me, it seems that all the high sheriffs of Essex County since Corwin, headquartered at the Salem Jail, located in the field where Giles Corey was crushed to death, died in office from heart attack, or were forced to resign because of heart conditions or blood ailments. The high sheriff, before I took office some 18 years ago, still suffers from a blood ailment that caused him to retire. And his father, the sheriff before him, died of a heart attack in office. When I was forced to retire in 1978, it was after suffering a heart attack, stroke, and undergoing many blood transfusions for a rare blood disease. Were we all victims, I wonder, of Giles Corey's curse? The Joshua Ward House still stands in Salem, and it was built on the foundations of what was George Corwin's home, where he was initially buried. As a result, the house is allegedly very haunted. In 1981, it was purchased by a man named Richard Carlson, who converted it into an office space for his real estate business. Soon after, Carlson's employees began reporting some spooky occurrences. One employee named Julie Tack told Bob Corwin, "Even though I lock my office door every night, when I open up in the morning, my lampshade or my wastebasket is tipped upside down, or all my desk items are scattered across the room and books are on the floor, pulled out of the bookcase. The crowning blow was when I arrived one morning to find the 2 brass candle holders on my fireplace mantle turned upside down, and the 2 candles were on the floor, one reshaped into a perfect S and the other bent like a boomerang. There was no logical way this could have happened unless the room got so hot during the night that the candles wilted. The fire alarms would go off constantly late at night, and some people reported even seeing what they believed to be a ghost, including Cahill's sister-in-law, Barbara Cahill. In her words, "I was sitting in the front office of the first floor waiting for Sherry Kerr to help me find an apartment. I immediately noticed a strange-looking woman sitting in a wingback chair across the hall in another office. The woman's skin didn't look like flesh, but was almost transparent like glass. She looked like a mannequin, just staring into space, and during the few minutes I was waiting for Sherry to get off the phone, the woman didn't move a muscle. Although other people were around, no one paid any attention to her. It was as if I was the only one who could see her. She looked really weird, with frizzled hair and wearing a long gray coat. She gave me a very eerie feeling, but then Sherry got off the phone and I turned away, never looking back into that room. I thought about that woman for days afterward, still wondering if she was a real person or not." Now, there is supposedly a photo of this ghost. I'm always very skeptical of ghost photography. It's way too easy to fake, but here it is. This was a Polaroid that was taken by an employee that shows a very spooky looking woman, the ghost of the Joshua Ward house. But is it really haunted? If you want to find out for yourself, you can actually stay at the Joshua Ward house. It's no longer an office. It is now a boutique hotel called The Merchant. Its name is a reference to its first owner, Joshua Ward, who was a successful merchant during the early days of the Republic. In 1789, George Washington spent a night there, and you can actually stay in the very room where the first president slept. If you have any haunted locations or spooky stories that you'd like me to cover on this show, be sure to let me know in the comments. And of course, if you love folklore, make sure to subscribe and share this with a friend or two. There are so many more legends and stories for us to cover. Be well, and I'll see you next time.